Welcome back to our final panel. You probably realized throughout the day what SSIR is about. We are about building bridges, connecting people, and it couldn't have been a better place for us to actually demonstrate that than this workshop, this conference on data on purpose, because you have realized who's sitting next to you. You know, we have participants, and Shannon mentioned that this morning, not only in terms of demographics and geographies, but also think about the sectors and different types of organization that you have heard from, seen, met today. Our next the leader of our panel, actually, Jake Porway, is embodying in a way another bridge that we are really deeply caring about building. And it's the bridge between research and practice. Now, Jake is the founder and an executive director of DataKind, a nonprofit that harnesses the power of data science in the service of humanity. He comes equipped with a degree from Columbia in computer science and with a master's and a doctorate from UCLA, the University of California, Los Angeles. He also is the holder of many awards, and one of them I wanted to mention specifically. He's a PopTech Social Innovation Fellow. Now, a number of years, our team ventured out to actually SSR going to meet PopTech. And, you know, it was for us obviously great to understand who is doing what there, but we felt, you know, this is a community that's a little bit distant from ours. And it makes us really proud that today here we have actually been able to build a bridge between different communities within the field of social innovation. Welcome, Jake.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Joanna, so much. Apparently one of the bridges I have not yet made is between my mouth and my water bottle. Started the panel off right. So you should all feel comfortable making a mess now. But I want to thank you guys so much for joining us for a panel on using data visualization to change the conversation. I'm joined by an incredibly esteemed panel here. Matt Sharpnick, who is the Chief Strategy Officer at Elephant Designs. Rahul Bhargava, who is at the Center for Civic Media at MIT and also runs Data Therapy. Kim Reese, who runs Periscopic, Data Visualization Group for Good. And the inimitable Michael Green, who runs the Social Progress Imperative. And I mention that because really what I wanted to do today was have you guys hear a little more from them than about me. And so a couple of things we want to do to set the ground rules for this ultimate panel of the day. The first is that you'll notice it's called Using Data Visualization to Change the Conversation. And we all got talking. We said, you know, almost any conversation about data visualization is almost too narrow a lens to look through, no pun intended. We're actually more interested in communication. How do people communicate around data? Once you've done a project, how do you share those results? And how do you think about that data and visualize it as you're actually doing the work? So we're going to talk a little bit more about a different but very related concept of how do you communicate with data, and what does that really take? And number two, I don't know about you guys, but last panel of the day, a long day can be a stultifying and soul-deadening experience if we just bloviate on and on. So what we've decided to do is liven it up a little bit, and I've asked all of the panelists to prepare a short story of a case study where data visualization did or did not change the story, did not change the conversation. So each of us is just going to give you a little quick lightning talk of something we've seen in our work so you can understand where we're coming from and where we're seeing things work or not. But then we want to actually go straight to asking questions. I believe the reason you're all in here and not scheduling a conference call instead is because you actually care about this, and so you probably have better questions than we would ever come up with. So hopefully we'll give you some food for thought, but I really want to see people line up right away because we would rather have that interactive conversation with you guys. So with that, I want to kick us off by just giving a little bit of my story. So I work at DataKind, and I owe many of the speakers money for the plugs earlier today. Thank you. It's nice that people are so supportive in the room. But for those who aren't familiar, we are a nonprofit that tries to bridge the gap between data scientists and social sector organizations. You know, time and time again, we're seeing that in these conversations, like Nancy and Andrew mentioned, our sector sees the power of data science and machine learning and predictive algorithms, but knowing where to start, affording a data scientist, building a data science team can be huge and daunting and expensive challenges. So we try to mitigate that by bringing together pro bono teams of people from Google or Facebook, all across Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and governments that want to give their time back but wouldn't know how to start, and pair them up with organizations that could use that kind of quick data innovation team. And the idea is that way you can get things started, right? You can start prototyping and building things. And to Nancy's point in the opening of the day, we want to go beyond just metrics and reporting and start building those dot organisms. So how can we prototype innovative machine learning solutions? How can we think about what you could use data for, what we could all use data for moving forward? And so I mentioned that as more than just a shameless plug, that we would love to talk to people who are interested in that kind of thing, but also to say, especially with this panel, that brings us to a lot of communication. So there's a lot of communication between the teams of people who are data scientists who now want to work alongside social sector organizations. And a lot of people who come with data are really asking, how do I use that data? What can I do with it? How can I share a result? How can I communicate better with what the data is saying? So the example that I wanted to talk about in my couple of minutes is with the New York City Parks Department. And the New York City Parks Department came and said, hey, we have data about every tree in the city. We use it for reporting. We want to tell people how many trees we planted, how many we dug up, what happened over the year. Can we visualize that data? We want to visualize it. We want to show a cooler report than what we usually show. And so we teamed them up with this guy, a guy named Brian D'Alessandro. He's a data scientist, the chief data scientist, in fact, at an ad tech company in New York. And they first started out by saying, hey, why do you want to visualize this data? What do you actually want to do with this? And they said, well, we want to show that we're effective. And in particular, there is a program where we prune tree limbs that could fall on people or cars, and we want to show that that is reducing the amount of emergencies in the city. He said, well, you probably don't need a visualization for that. In fact, you could probably plug in the same algorithms that we use every day to figure out if he shows you an ad, whether you're more or less likely to buy something. You can actually use those same statistical models to say, hey, if we cut down these tree limbs, are we more or less likely to see a change, fewer fatalities? And so lo and behold, they ran the algorithms, and it turned out that, yeah, they were reducing tree emergencies, as they call them, by 22% where they were using this program. So it was great. It was a great finding. Other cities started imitating it. It wasn't something that needed visualization. However, one of the really cool things that his team did was they did say, why don't we visualize where all the trees in New York are? And so they built this app called Canopy. It lets you look at where the trees are located. And so what you're looking at here is a density of pin oaks, I believe, in New York. And this is an open source tool called CartoDB. You can throw this data up there very easily. But what was great about this was not that this helped New York City Parks Department answer questions. It didn't help them say, are we more or less effective? What it did help them do was ask questions. Because as they looked at this, they started to say, man, why are there so many pin oaks up in some of these areas? That doesn't seem like what we expected. And they dug into it a little bit, and it turned out that when people go out to plant trees, sometimes they have a surplus. Some trees didn't really work out. There wasn't a way to actually put them into the place they were supposed to go, so people bringing the trees back will just plant them wherever. Not bad. It's great to have a tree show up unexpectedly at your house. It's kind of nice in New York. But something that the Parks Department never even knew was happening before. And it was only when you were able to visualize this data that they were able to ask that question and say, hey, what the heck is going on there? And now Jim Fruchterman talked about having big data earlier today. And of course, big data holds huge promise. But honestly, to me, big data is more data than I want to look at by hand. And talk about 1,000 rows of tree data. That's more than enough for me to say you need to turn to some computational methods. So the takeaway for me from this project that I hope informs a little bit of our conversation is, one, lots of people come asking for visualization, but sort of haven't yet thought through the question of, I think in our sector we need to know visualization for what? But also that visualization shouldn't just be an end goal. That actually, in its best form, visualization is a process. Because with all this data out there, we're suddenly given this gift of new eyes. And visualization is a way to see those things that we could no longer see before. You can't look out your window and see 9 billion tweets. You can't see credit card transactions. So using data visualization not to answer the questions alone, but to ask them, I think was a very big learning lesson for us. So that's my story, but to tell you a little bit more about someone who is very versed in building data visualizations for people, I'm going to turn it over to Matt Sharpnick. So give it up for Matt. Back here.
Well, thank you all for staying, and for those of you who are, for staying awake. It's always an honor to speak next to Jake, someone whose name is mentioned so many times throughout the conference. I co-founded a studio called Elephant Designs, and we do design work for good causes, and data visualization is something we do a lot of. And seems to be what people want to hear about mostly these days, and it's a lot of fun. I really like data visualization, so I just wanted to run through a really quick example. Those who are already familiar with it know that there is this whole school of thought into information design, which is really its own subset of design that has its own rules and best practices. And what we really try to do at Elephant is to mix a lot of that with things that are going to engage people and keep them interested in the information, because we live in an age when even something that's got really good information design sometimes depends on people spending a lot of time with the piece, and they've got to give it their attention. And sometimes you have to grab people before that's going to happen. So this was something that a designer put together who didn't have as much experience in information design, and this was kind of a first crack at this piece for us. And you can see that everything is pie charts. And there's a lot of reasons why that's not good. I think from both an information design standpoint and from an interest standpoint, I don't really want to look at this. And then when I do, I don't know if 1 in a million can really be put into a pie chart unless you have a microscope. So if you're trying to show something dramatic, looking at 1 in a million versus like 1 in 100 isn't really going to look very much different. So the point here, this is for a piece we did for Infograph, which is a sister site which looks at controversial issues and tries to look at the information and the data and the science and then just present it objectively. And this is a piece we're going to have coming out soon. This is the first time I've showed it to anybody on vaccine data. So anyways, more pie charts. So this was the second attempt at it, also somebody who doesn't have a lot of experience with information design. And they tried to make it more engaging, which I think they did. There's like some colors there, and pill bottles are thematic, also not very good from an information design standpoint. And I see this and I kind of want to turn away from it. So looking at this, I kind of took a step back and said, okay, what are we trying to do here? And I unfortunately don't have very good visual design skills, so I can only get up to the sketching phase. But I decided to sketch something out and work with one of our designers. And then we came up with this, which I hope people think is better. And basically what we want to do is, and this goes back to strategy and story, and I hope I'm not going too long on time here, but I'll just finish up, which is that we want people to really understand the audience and what they're trying to figure out with the information and present that as simply as possible, because there's all sorts of information we could focus on here. And here we have people who are trying to decide, really, what are the risks if I get the disease? What are the risks if I get the vaccine? So we've color-coded this. Yellow means that there's some effect that's not, it's kind of mild, orange is moderate, red is severe, and then you can see how high the instance of these things are. So just by glancing at this, you see that the disease has very severe consequences and there's a very high likelihood of getting them, whereas the vaccine has less frequent and they're not very severe, and then the severe ones are almost immeasurable on there. So these are the kinds of things we think about when we do data visualization. Hopefully we'll get into it a little bit more, and I guess I give it back to Jake.
Fantastic. Thank you, Matt. Awesome. So good. And I think this is great because oftentimes we see the end result of visualization, but rarely do you get to see the process, what actually happens. So I think that was super informative. Thank you, Matt. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rahul to tell us a little bit more about his work at MIT's Center for Civic Media and Data Therapy. So give it up for Rahul.
Thank you. Right. Thanks for that. Shoot, that actually got cut off. So I just want to tell one story. I work a lot on data literacy and trying to actually think about how to make working with data fun. So just in this room, it might be higher, but let's ask it anyway. How many people associate the word fun with the work you do with data? Raise your hand if you do, right? All right. So there's actually a lot of nerds in this room, right? That's great. Any other room I ask that in, there's like one person and I know them, and they're raising their hand, right? So I try to meet people where they are, working with small community organizations. I run a program called Data Therapy that tries to work on building capacity in organizations to do the data work themselves, right? I don't need to do the partnership. These guys got that stuff covered, right? So I try to build capacity. I do that by meeting people where they are. So one way that we do that is by using the arts as an invitation, right? Because everybody likes playing with crayons and googly eyes and pipe cleaners. So I start there. And in that space, one thing we've done is created a set of data murals and a process for creating them. So what's a data mural look like? Well, we meet an organization and we work with a small group of people to look at the data that might support one of their programs. We start there. We run a workshop with a bunch of people that are involved in the organization, constituencies of various types, to help them find a story they want to tell in that data, right? So we start with information, turn it into a story they want to tell. We facilitate that process. The next step is we take that story, and we run a really fun collaborative exercise to turn that into a visual design for a mural. So everyone participates in a visual design. We have a designer turn that into one cohesive design, and then we paint it. Big community mural, right? So, you know, I don't need to tell you guys. You know this. You work with a community organization. Any of them can pull together a mural. They know an artist over there. They got people, a youth program over there. You can make a mural. Totally non-intimidating, right? So that's great. It results in a mural at the end. The piece that we actually care about, just to hammer on this process point, is the stuff that happens in that process while we're moving from here to a visual design to a mural, right? That's the capacity being built. And we end up with great results like this thing that you can read half of, which says, we have never come together with data before, ever, right? And this is someone that scribbled it down while we were doing a data mural with Head Start. So for those of you who don't know Head Start, I guess the way to characterize it in the US is early childhood intervention. So we worked with Head Start as part of a federal program, Collaborate for Healthy Weight. That was a federal program. And they wanted to communicate some of their data about what was happening and the barriers to healthy living. But that doesn't matter, because what the process allowed them to do was use the data as sort of a Trojan horse to bring together the communities that they cared about and reinforce the work that they were doing, right? So we're talking parents of Head Start families, parent advocates within Head Start themselves, Head Start staff, and sort of like the oversight people, the grant funding people. All of them in a room together, talking to each other about data, right? Building a shared language, breaking down power dynamics in the room, and reinforcing the idea that they're all in it together. And I'm not even going to show you the mural. I'll just tease it. If you want to see it, it's at datamurals.org. Because the point wasn't the mural. The point was this, right?
I'm sad about this.
The mural's great. But the point was this, right? This is the outcome. I'm sure I have my logic model, and the mural is one of the outcomes, changing the public space. But reinforcing the connections between each of these organizations was far more important. And the data was a way to do that, and suddenly they were all wondering what questions they could ask of the data, and ask together. And that's the sort of thing I care about, building that data literacy, using it to reinforce the stuff that's already happening.
Nice. Thanks, John. Very good.
I left the thing over there.
Oh, great, thanks. Weird musical chairs going on. Yeah, thank you. I think that's so great, because there it wasn't even just about the output or learning from the sort of intermediary results, but the process of creating a visualization together. I think that's really interesting. I know a lot of the people in this room have had experiences, I'm sure, where the data has actually brought people together to think better about that. So I love that. With that, I'd like to give it up to Kim Reese, who runs Periscopic, whose tagline is "Do Good with Data." They're one of the few data visualization firms I know of doing this kind of work, so I'm very excited to introduce Kim Reese.
Hello. Like Jake said, we're a data visualization firm. We're based in Portland, Oregon, and we're just in our 12th year. So we've been doing this for a while and seen a lot of changes in the industry. It's been really exciting. Our tagline is "Do Good with Data." So we work primarily with organizations who are making a positive impact in the world that can cover a lot of things, from human rights to conservation to education, you name it. We have a lot of really beautiful, wonderful clients that we serve. I completely broke the rules here that Jake gave us with providing one case study, because I have two kids who just went through about 14 different types of infections at home, and I forgot the rules. So I actually have 3 examples.
Disruption, it's fun. Innovate.
The first example is a piece that we did internally. It was about gun homicides in the United States. It's an interactive piece that goes through all of the people who were killed by guns in 2012 and 2010 and 2013. And it illustrates their lives and then how long they could have lived. As far as the conversation that it evoked, it was a really very interesting piece. We developed it after the Newtown killings, and just out of our own sense of desire to use our skills for good. And so we developed it internally and put it out there. And the conversation that arose was really amazing, because it really went across the spectrum of people who were, gun control advocates, obviously were behind it. But it struck a nerve with gun rights advocates because it was sort of presented on the stark plane of facts. It was just looking at numbers. It wasn't hitting you with a narrative. It wasn't giving you, the message up front. It just started with the actual numbers and the facts. And so we got into a lot of really interesting conversation with gun rights advocates. One in particular who contacted me over Twitter, and we had a really lengthy conversation where he kept coming back to me with questions about looking at data in different ways. And I was able to give him answers based on the data that we had. And so I gave him an answer to every single one of the questions that he came back with, and he finally ended the conversation by thanking me. And he said, I never thought I would have looked at this data in this light, given my upbringing. So it was a really great opportunity for us to engage on that level. This is another piece that we did internally. I just like it. It didn't provoke any conversations yet. We just released it last year, and we haven't promoted it much. It's actually looking at the terrorist organizations around the globe, or I should say groups who use terrorist tactics, because they're not always categorized as terrorist groups. And it's interesting because some of the findings that come out of this were really compelling, such as, so these are 25 of the most active groups in the world over a span of 30 years. And then there's a humongously long tail of groups that aren't very active or who had spurts of activity. And it was really compelling to see the different tactics and the different types of effects of these groups over the years. So ISIS has pretty much blown everybody else out of the water. But then other groups like Al-Qaeda are extremely effective in their per incident rates of casualties. So it was a really interesting piece, and we're hoping to bring that to different groups and look at the data actually in a little bit more depth. This was a piece that we used to develop some skills with our interns. So this was kind of a small piece that we're hoping to build upon. And the last piece was actually one that had a really great conversation come out of it. This is a piece we did for the Iraq and Afghanistan Veterans of America. It's a nonprofit based out of New York, and one of the things that they deal with is the backlog of VA claims and the health care provided to vets. And they were sort of tired of the conversation revolving around the VA, and they have this backlog, and yes, there's this big hoo-ha about it, but for the most part, the general public agrees, hey, it's bad, and everyone says, of course, vets should have proper health care and whatnot, so it's sort of this one-sided conversation where everybody sort of agrees upon it, but nothing ever gets done. And so they developed this piece where the vets themselves are able to input their own stories, and then you can interactively go into each of these stories and see where people are feeling these pain points. Is it filing claims? Is it getting their health care? So it's actually representing each individual. It has over 2,000 vets who've responded in the last couple of months. And it's a really great piece, and the interesting piece about it was that actually the secretary of the VA responded to it. Once it came out, it was so powerful that he responded and said, he set up a specific line that the vets who use this could contact in order to help get their claims processed. So I'll leave it at that in my 3 stories.
Great. Thank you, Kim. Thank you. And a quick show of hands, how many people have seen the live version of Guns? The project that Kim just talked about? Awesome. I'm going to break convention and actually show you the live version because I think this is instructive for many other reasons. It is not only a very powerful visualization. Oops, I wonder if I can refresh this. Nothing better than watching a dude work a computer. Oh, you guys can't see that, can you? Bummer. Yep, I'm just gonna bring it over there. So I think, Kim showed the static version, but these were the arcs that were, and I'm sorry, I'm narrating your piece, but
Go ahead.
the arcs of people killed, and you can see sort of, where they died and sort of the lives they could have lived.
Jake, if you move it over, you can see another number on the other side. Sorry, I'm a little bit of a perfectionist about our work.
I figured people were getting the solemnity of it, even without the numbers. Guys, it's about the feeling.
There you go. Thank you.
Sorry, guys, it's a weird angle. Kim, does this go in real time? It's the whole year. So while this is playing out, one of the reasons I wanted to show this was not only how powerful it is to, I think, to see these arcs grow, and I know this is sort of above and beyond maybe your average bar chart in the kind of work that's done. But also this has a huge data component. You may ask, well, how do you know how many stolen years there were? And Kim can correct me where I'm wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, this was, that was figured out by taking stats from the CDC and the World Health Organization to say, hypothetically, given the statistics of this person, the demographics that was killed at this point, how might they have lived? Obviously, it's not guaranteed, but at least to model that. So it actually uses a bit of data analysis itself. And then I won't go into this now, but when it's done, you can actually explore the data itself. So I wanted to just call that out because I didn't think the static version really did justice to that. And it's such a good piece.
Thank you.
All right, and with that, last but certainly not least, I'd like to bring Michael Green, the founder of the Social Progress Imperative, up here. So give it up for Michael.
Thank you, Jake. I'm here because I'm actually a complete fraud. I'm not a data scientist. I'm not a data visualization expert. The story I'm going to tell you isn't mine. It isn't true. And I'm probably is an argument that's against data visualization. So there we are, complete fraud. Leave now if you wish. The story I'm going to tell you, many of you will probably know. It comes from the fantastic science fiction novel, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you saw the movie, I'm sorry, give the book a chance. But in the story is a civilization, some far-off galaxy, builds a computer to answer the ultimate question, the meaning of the life, universe, and everything. And the computer says, it'll take me 1,000,000 years to calculate it. And after 1,000,000 years, it comes back and says, the answer to the ultimate question, the meaning of the life, universe, and everything is 42. Yeah? And I think that is the most fantastic gag about how we think about economic policy. Because if you watch your news at night, we'll get a number. The Dow Jones has gone up by such to such. What on earth does that mean? It's a random number. Yeah? We talk about GDP and we say, oh, we've done really well. It's grown by 3%. And our life is sort of dominated. Our economic decision-making is dominated by these very clear single numbers. Now, I'm an economist by background, so like everyone else in the economic profession, there was an enormous crisis in 2008 that I very much saw as being a crisis of measurement. And that's therefore what my organization, the Social Progress Imperative, does is we're working on a complementary measure to GDP called the Social Progress Index. And in designing that Social Progress Index, we really learned from the playbook of GDP, which is that GDP is that simple number. A politician can say, I've done a great term in office, the economy has grown by 3% every year. And it works for political communication. And so I suppose my point, my anti-data visualization point is to really have political traction, to really become part of the currency of conversation, you almost have to have facts, numbers, that can be communicated without snazzy data visualization. It's going to be part of that currency. And that really influenced how we created the Social Progress Index, lots of clever stuff on the back end, but being able to come up with not a dashboard, but a simple number, and then to be able to say, actually, no, Bangladesh is doing better than India. Ghana's doing better than Nigeria. The UK is doing better than the United States, blah, 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 in a very kind of simple ordering and ranking. So that's sort of my basic message. Just want to show you a couple of slides, how we can then reinforce the point with data visualization. Here, because we don't have any GDP in the model, we can look at social progress against GDP to reinforce the point that, yes, it's good for countries to get richer. You do get better societies in general, but it's not a perfect correlation. GDP is not destiny. You do have choices. There are some countries above the line that are better at turning their GDP into social progress than others that are below the line. So we can just use that visualization to emphasize that point. And then secondly, if we want to drill down, we can use very traditional stoplight methodology to have a high impact message to say how a country is doing. And I'm very sorry, here's the United States, and it doesn't look very good. There we go. Thank you.
Oh. Just like that. Way to leave on a positive note. So there you have it, a diversity of projects where people have used data to change the conversation, to change the conversations people are having with each other, to change the conversations you're having about why you should or shouldn't use pie charts, or to change the conversation about how we are all doing. So as promised, I would love to throw it out to you guys. So please, if you have a question, come up to the mics, or you just want to stretch your legs, please take a moment to come up. And while we are waiting for people to get up the nerve to actually take that stand, I thought one of the things that would be a sort of common question on people's minds might be to you guys to talk a little bit about what are the kinds of, we talked a bit about when you go into making a visualization. So what are the kinds of questions people should be thinking about when they're thinking, hey, I want to visualize something? What are the things that you should bring up to make for a good visualization?
You're looking at me, Jake.
Kim, do you mind kicking us off?
What kind of questions? I think the best times we've had with clients have been when they come to us with their own legitimate questions about what they're doing and what their data is showing. Sometimes we get requests to, hey, tell this such and such a story, and here's the data to back it up. And those can be great, and those can be great communication pieces. But often we find that those are really preaching to the choir, because they're already things that you're already talking about, right? And now you're just talking about them again through data, which is fine, and it's just approaching a different kind of audience who is numbers oriented, and that's a fine activity to do. But the most fun, I think, is answering those burning questions that you all have internally. Where, things like where can we have more impact? Where, should we be looking in other areas? Is there other data that we can bring into this to broaden our scope or offerings, or maybe get into a new program area? Are there things about these lagging program areas that we can do to bolster them? Are there success stories we can take from the ones who are doing really well and having great impact? Can we apply that to other areas? What's different about those things? Those types of questions always let you look at the data with new eyes. Who was it who said the gift of new eyes? Was that you? That was you. That was you, Jake. The gift of new eyes. I think that's such a beautiful saying, and it's so true. It's if you can start to see things differently, even through data that you've used forever and ever, that's a great approach to take. So I think just being authentic with where you're at, even if it's from a space of we have no idea what we have and where we can go with this, that's a great starting point because it's honest.
And so start with where you're at and use it to learn new things, really address things. I like that. The question over there, I'd love to take.
Hi, my name is Melissa Howell.
Hey, Melissa.
I'm with the Africa America Institute. It's a 62-year-old organization that builds capacity for individuals and institutions on the continent of Africa. One of the things that I've kind of been thinking about through the various panels is just the participation of community in all different aspects of the data process, from defining the problem, the questions to ask, gathering the data, analyzing, and actually just presenting the data. From some of the work that, that we are doing, what I'm realizing and some of the conversations we're having about knowledge production and data production lends itself to, this idea that there is different value placed on who's participating in the production of data and knowledge. And so I'm just thinking, it's just a challenge I've had, and I wanted to just kind of present this idea or this thought around, the narrative that's being shared through data and kind of what role or like implicit or explicit value we've been placing or we place on data depending on who's involved. And so I would just like to pose that because it's a challenge for me, and I've just kind of thought about it throughout the course of the day, thanks to the hosts and sponsors. But would love to just hear thoughts on that.
Great, thank you, Melissa. I was actually going to, if you don't mind, send this to Rahul first to talk a bit about the participatory aspect.
Sure, yeah. I struggle with that every day, right? I mean, we did, to touch on an early story, we did a data mural with some of the data from from a Boys and Girls Club right near us, right? And this was a Boys and Girls Club where they had these kids filling out surveys on a computer, once a week about what their experiences are like, why they feel safe, all these things. We took that information back to the kids in the program and had them identify a story they really liked in the data and paint it as a mural in their gym, right? And that's an ownership story, and I like to think it's an empowerment story, right? And that, to me, is really powerful. The idea that you can empower the folks that are traditionally the disempowered who the data is about. And then those who are telling the data stories are generally the powerful in any social structure who have the information and the skills to tell that story. And the approaches we're seeing and the hype we're seeing around data, like everything else in our world, tends to reinforce those power structures, right? So I like to really try to attack that and flip it around to turn it into an empowerment story. And there's sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But the participation is a key part of that because it's about ownership at each stage in the pipeline.
And Matt, you wanted to jump in on that too.
Yeah, well, on both of those questions, I was going to attempt to try to tie them together, but now I've heard so much that I'm a little lost. But I think there's a few things. There's different kinds of visualizations for different kinds of audiences, and it's going to, I think, span the gamut here of different things we've talked about. So one is when we're creating pieces for Infograph, our goal there is to look at what's going on in the public dialogue, what kind of conversations are happening, and where's that falling short, and what's the role of information design to sort of equal the playing field. Because we have a piece that I show a lot on the budget in 2012, and there were budget cuts that were proposed. And at that time, one of the political parties was arguing that we should cut certain things very strongly, and another was saying we shouldn't. And when you looked at it, the party that wanted to cut it was because they wanted to lower the debt. It was like 0.0001%. We have this great chart where it's like you can't even see the dot, and then this is the circle of the debt. And so it's a dishonest argument. And so, maybe I am, I'm not, depending on the subject matter, the representative of that information, but what I think we allow people to do in those situations is to see, here's a tool for you to level the playing field a little bit, because someone has this platform and can stand up and can speak on a certain issue, and they're defining that debate by doing that. And we don't have to take a position one way or the other, but we can say, okay, if you want to have an argument about this, you can advocate that this program should or shouldn't be funded. But if you're arguing it based on a financial basis, it's total bullshit. And you can call that out now with this number, right? Are we allowed to cuss here? Is this on the radio?
It's too late now. It's got a 5-second delay on
And so anyways, just to finish, I think whenever we start any project, we examine who the audience is going to be very carefully. And we think about, if you're trying to build a piece for your donors, then yeah, you probably are going to have an agenda, right? And you're going to say, try to find a story here that our donors are going to like. And I think there's an obligation for people doing data visualization to do that in a way that you feel is honest. We personally would not create that chart in a way that made 2013 twice the size it really was just because someone asked us to. So there's an ethical component to it. But if someone's coming to you and saying, here's the data, help us find a story in this data, then you have a much more open ability to dig in there and see what matters and tell an honest story. You don't have an agenda predefined. So I think there's a lot of different scenarios with different project types.
So I like the theme that we're hearing here about creating tools and methods for participatory action. And Michael, I know you want to jump in on this because I know Social Progress Indicator has some sort of community-based and participatory aspects. Do you mind giving a brief thought on that, and then we have people patiently standing?
Yeah, I just want to say, Matthew, I mean, the tool is my favorite word. If we can put a tool into people's hands, they're the real people who drive change. And I love it when I see people creating much better data visualizations with our data than we create, because it's customized for their audiences. They know the audience, they know who they're communicating with, and they produce great stuff. And that's the best thing, because that's useful, that's the tool.
Very, very well said. I love it. Yes.
Hi. So one of the things that struck me as we were seeing all the examples is just really how interdisciplinary creating visualizations is, right? And I can easily see where a data scientist fits in, where a visual designer fits in. And I'm curious, especially with the really emotionally powerful visualization. So Kim, maybe when you were putting together the guns example, what are some of the other skills and types of people you're going to need around the table to create something like that? Because I'm guessing it's not just visual design and data science. There's more going on there.
More unicorns. That's great.
It's a wild mix. It's really hard to answer because I've seen it in a lot of different blends. It is visual design, there is UX design, there's data science. I think the crux of many great visualizations is the conceptual design. So just looking at the data, understanding the shape of it, getting some sort of metaphor in order to tell that story in the most elegant and succinct way. That's, it doesn't come out of a degree at school, unfortunately. You find it in a lot of different ways. We have people at Periscopic who come from all different walks of life. We have people who started in biology. We have people who started in economics. Our lead developer has a master's of fine arts. I mean, it comes from all different areas. And for us, the biggest thing that we find with people that we hire is just, it's sort of a blend between, having organizational skills, understanding like how to organize things, but also sort of a creative angle to that. So it's really a blend of the art and science. One of the things that we do in all of our interviews is we have this thing called a jar of whimsy. And it's just a jar full of stuff, weird stuff that you pull out of your desk drawer, erasers and googly eyes and pipe cleaners and all sorts of crazy stuff. And we dump it out on the table and we say, okay, organize this, there are no rules. And we let the person sit there as long as they'd like, and then we come back and we say, explain this to us. And usually it's a pretty good indicator of whether they will be able to, step up to the challenge of data visualization. But in totally different ways. Like we've had one of our designers made this great organization of like the personalities of the objects. So there were some that were like doomed by their own utility. So there were things like cough drops and things like that. And things that will stick together no matter what, paper clips and rubber bands. And it was this great organization that only a designer would come up with, and that really was like, yes, we need that kind of person who can see that creative side of it.
Kim, if I could jump in on that, I was going to say, we face this problem at DataCon. It's one of the toughest types of people to get to volunteer at a time is this magical mix. So for people who are wondering where to get those skills or gain those skills, where do you find those people? You just go dumping jars of stuff in front of people and seeing how it goes?
Randomly on the bus.
Are there specific places you find this? I know you said it's a mix.
Thankfully, a lot of people come to us. So we are sort of a unicorn in the field. So thankfully, we serve a space that many people want to be in. And we're in a really hot field, so we have a nice blend that people want to come to.
So go to Periscopic. I want to keep the questions moving. I saw you first.
Hi, I'm Kara Willis with Opportunity Nation, and one of the things we do is measure opportunity at the community level across the U.S., and opportunity can be a really difficult topic to wrap your brain around. So we try and break that down, but one of the areas I'm interested in us exploring and would love your thoughts on this is responsive technology. As we're sitting at this conference, most of us have our cell phones out, not necessarily laptops. So how are you guys thinking about responsive technology in your data visualization?
Good question. Anyone feel inclined to have an obvious answer?
We think about it. When we design things, we design them for mobile as well, usually. I mean, some of our older pieces are more static. And again, we're sometimes designing visualizations for an organization to take to Congress and lobby about it or pitch a subcommittee. So it doesn't really matter in that situation. But if we're creating an interactive piece for the web, then we're going to probably design it mobile first. Or at least we're going to try to summarize some of the key points so that someone can go and have the full experience. Because sometimes there's certain types of experiences that you're just not going to have on a mobile screen, and this whole mobile-first web kind of movement can sometimes push you to do that when maybe that's not the best fit. So, classic, it depends answer.
If I can jump in on that, I feel like that's a smaller subsection of a sort of larger question. So if I take that question and open it up, then it makes me just reflect on the context, right? So anytime you're designing a sort of data-driven story or presentation to tell or show, you need to be concerned about the context that you're showing it in. And context includes like whether it was after lunch or not, whether it's the last panel on the day, whether people are on the train in a mobile device. Those are all questions of context. So it goes back to those same tenets of defining your audience, knowing your goals, defining your context really well, and like the crappy answers to those are, my audience is the general public, and my goal is to raise awareness, and my context is anywhere. And people in this room know better answers than that. But it's the same fundamental question, I feel like. So when I think about mobile ways to view some of the interactive data projects that I've done, I've always gone back to those fundamental pillars of good design. Like, what's the context? How can I design for that context?
And I will echo, I think that is a theme that has been coming up across the panels all today, all across the board on everything, is sort of the to what end, right? So who are you creating, what's the context people are seeing your work in? Why do you want to do data mining? What is, to what end? I think there's a lot of these things right now that feel very shiny. And I'm glad that we're sort of at that level of the hype curve that we're starting to say now, okay, well, what are the really valuable uses of this? So I'm glad, actually, and heartened to hear that a repeated theme throughout the day. That's great. Yes, you over there.
Hey, yeah, so
Hey.
I was just wondering, one of the things that was coming up a lot in everything the panel was discussing was, that it's a tool to empower the people who are the subject of the data. And one theme that I've seen, especially as the web has become more interactive, this kind of ties into the previous question. What do you guys see as the role of kind of exploratory versus explanatory data visualization, meaning where the user can kind of create their own narrative and explore the data as they see fit, rather than just presenting them with a one-dimensional view, so to speak. You can kind of, filter it and view it as you desire. So I'm curious what you guys see as trends in that direction, and what the future of more exploratory interactive data visualization is.
It's such a great question. And I know, Michael, you said you're a fraud, which is not true. But I wonder if we could actually throw that to you, because I know one of the cool things about the indicator is that it, at least as I understand it, does not seek to say, here is the answer, as much as explore for yourself.
Yes, I mean, the slide I showed you for the US shows a benchmarking against countries of similar GDP. So that's saying, how is the US doing against countries with similar economic resources? But what we've found in different places is that there are different benchmarks. For example, we're talking to people in Costa Rica. Costa Rica does very well on the Social Progress Index. But Costa Rica aspires to be a member of the OECD. So actually we work with them to do a whole different cut of the data saying, how do you compare to that peer group? And I think having that flexibility that fits into your own narrative actually empowers people to then contextualize it and make the message relevant. I think also, what we would love to see is more people sort of creating these kind of indices from the bottom up, using some of the new technology. And can I just say, one thing I always get really annoyed about whenever I present the index is we use some survey data. And people always go about, oh, well, it's not like hard data, is it? It's like when you're measuring people's real lived experience, that's incredibly important. It doesn't matter whether you pass laws or spend money if people's real lived experience on issues sucks. And so I think really having that, using the capacity of new technology to really allow people to speak about their real quality of life is something I'm very, really excited about, how we can change a whole bunch of conversations using insight from people's real lived experience.
I like that, yeah. Rahul.
Can I jump on that one too? This sort of explanatory, exploratory thing comes up a lot in the teaching I do. And I tend to try to shift the conversation to a spectrum of opinionated and non-opinionated. So it's more about the author rather than the reader. Because if you're trying to change a conversation, you probably are on the opinionated side of telling a story, right? And it's a spectrum, right? So I mean, you see conscious decisions, for instance, in Kim's piece, in the Periscopic piece, to say years lost, right? Like that's just kick-ass copywriting. Like that's just really good. Like that's a very strong, sort of subtle movement towards the opinionated, right? That this is an issue that matters because years were lost, right? So you're an editor when you're doing that. And I think people are moving back and forth, but whenever you're having an advocacy conversation or trying to change a conversation, you kind of want to be over on the opinionated side because like, you have an opinion.
Right.
And you're trying to and there's different ways to express it.
Interesting. So is the argument you're making there, just maybe I missed it, is that you want to be more on the explanatory side when you're making an advocacy case, or were you even saying
Yes.
that even in exploratory sense there's
Yes.
not?
No, I think if you're like strong advocacy with, depending on the audience, right, with populations that you're trying to talk to that may not be sort of, that you want to have, that you're having a call to action, like you can't, like, show me good examples that are unopinionated or exploratory that have a very strong, effective call to action. I don't see very many of those.
Interesting.
I just don't.
Yeah, I mean, I want to jump on this too. I disagree with you somewhat. I'm not sure I have a great example for you.
Good.
But I think that one of the things that we try to do is create a sense of ownership, much in the same way you described with giving the kids a chance to tell their own story. If you allow people to find themselves in the data, that is hugely empowering. So that exploratory angle can really, really engage people at a level that explanatory can't. Explanatory is, you know, in most practical senses is mandatory to some degree. A way that we try to bridge that gap is we either start with, we usually start with exploratory, so give them an opportunity to go in and play around, but also give them like key findings. So even the gun visualization at the, if you scroll down, there are key findings like 58% of people are shot with a handgun. So it gives you a way to sort of, you know, it gives you a railing to grasp onto, to say, okay, I don't, you know, I'm exploring, but I'm overwhelmed, or I don't know what to think. Okay, here are some key points that I can sort of situate myself within and grasp onto. But giving people the opportunity to dig into that data, and also to Michael's point of that subjective data and getting down to that raw level, as raw as you can, hugely empowering. If you can get down to that personal level, even if it's subjective, even if it's not like, oh, you know, 33% of blah, 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 the more individualized you can get, people can see themselves in that. They can find their way, and that's a really beautiful space to be in. I think those are always the best for us because we get the greatest, you know, impact and people who are talking about it in interesting ways.
Yeah, finding yourself in the data, I think that's big. And Rahul, before you jump in, I know Matt, you were leaning forward, and I think this probably touches everyone. Did you? You guys obviously build a lot of, you know, explanatory visualizations. How do you
Yeah,
look at
so
this?
one example, be a lot easier if I could show you, but basically, if you see anything that shows the US debt, it kind of looks like this. You sometimes see these hockey stick graphs. If you adjust that as a percentage of GDP, then the graph starts to go up, comes back down, and starts to go up again, but it hasn't reached what it was in like 1945 because we had much higher debt as a percentage of GDP during World War II than we do now. So some people will look at that and say, wow, that hockey stick one was a total lie. It wasn't adjusted for inflation. We shouldn't be so worried about the debt. Other people would say, well, even when you adjust it, it's climbing up near its historical high. So you'll get, depending on what people's predispositions are, you can put something out there that's not meant to be advocating a certain position. And what we also did was we added economic data on there, and then you see, wow, actually spending spikes during periods of recession. And we showed who controlled Congress during all those periods. And some people looked at the chart and said, I never realized that the Democrats controlled both houses of Congress for 40 years. That was a completely different story, unrelated to what we were talking about. So I think you can have all of those things going on, and our intention is always to say, do we see dishonest arguments happening? And if we do, how do we expand the level of discourse? And then from there, people will take that in different directions.
Well, and I just want to add on to that to say, I think, you know, I'm going to take the paternalistic view here that when we're building visualizations or really any communication around data, it does feel that there's maybe some responsibility to talk about sort of the rules of the road, like how this can and can't be used. And I saw similar situations, slightly different, where in New York City, there was stop and frisk data, a very controversial program. People could be stopped and frisked. That data was opened up, and people had a field day visualizing this data. How wonderful. They built all these exploratory tools. They could look into it themselves. They could probably find themselves. And you saw this almost war of pictures, where one person would say, look at all the gun violence in this area, and all the stop and frisks are somewhere else. Stop and frisk doesn't work. And then someone else says, well, no, you did the color coding wrong. Change the colors. Now, look, they're all aligned. Stop and frisk does work. And it became this kind of free-for-all where anyone who could tweak the data or create a slightly different visualization was drawing totally different conclusions from it, which is, I think, one step maybe even beyond just looking at someone else's creation where you might be able to insert some sort of interpretation and just sort of leaving it to the interpretation of people who can build things. I wonder, I mean, my soapbox is that this requires more sort of visual literacy to do that well, but yeah, Michael, you have one last comment.
I just wanted to ask, I mean, on that example, I mean, one of the big problems we have in the world is the partisans shouting at each other and the lack of proper debate and deliberation around the facts. Did that example actually lead to some better debate and discussion?
That's a great question that I can't speak to fully. I know they repealed stop and frisk. Something happened. I don't know if it was that or the Civil Liberties Union or cutting funding or something else.
I think you bring up a really great point, Jacob, that you can't just do data science in a vacuum. You can't just do visualization in a vacuum. You know, we sometimes get data in our hands and say, oh, this is so much fun. Let's just make a visualization. And then we realize, you know, we don't really know much about this data. We did that with the piece on terrorism. We found that database. It was a database that I'd wanted to use for a couple of years. It's this fantastic data set out of the University of Maryland by this group called the START Consortium. And it's incredibly rich data. And so when I got a data science intern, I set her loose on it and said, hey, go nuts, let's do a visualization. And so once we got into it, we're like, oh, we could look at this, and we could look at that, and look at this group is crazy, and look at that group, they did all this stuff. And pretty soon we were like completely overwhelmed, and we didn't know which end was up, and we had no idea how to make sense of it. And so we ended up using the START Consortium as a consultant on the piece and saying, okay, here's what we're looking at. Does this make any sense to you? And the head of the consortium was fantastic and came back to us with tons of her domain expertise, where she said, oh, that's interesting that you found that. Here's why you probably shouldn't include that group. It's, this is why it's an anomaly, and, all of these political reasons that went around it, and different things that were happening in different countries, and she was just a wealth of information, and it was like really sort of put us in our place.
Great argument for collaborations across the spaces. Love it. We're up against time, but you've been waiting so patiently. I'd like to give you the last question.
So it's probably going to groan, but kind of bringing it back down to a practitioner level. When should you use a map? Because that tends to become the so some guidance on that. And since I think a lot of organizations have situations where they're trying to compare sites or programs or partners, how do it always seems so boring when you put that data out that compares folks. So I was just wondering if you had some insights on either of those.
Interesting. Rapid fire. Our maps, the Portlandia, just put a bird on it. Just ideas from the panel. Just put it on a map.
I can't answer that quickly.
Okay.
I have strong opinions about maps. I mean, maps are great in many ways for many audiences that are sort of map literate. You can identify yourself on it. You trade away a lot of graphic design abilities to map data onto different aspects. Like on traditional maps, you can't change location and place. Just because data doesn't have has latitude and longitude doesn't mean that showing it on a map is the best way to present it. You can't unpick that very quickly.
Oh yeah, please just jump in.
Can you answer?
Don't be polite.
No, all I can say is if you put it on a map, I'll read it. I'll read anything on a map.
So if that's your audience, then put it on a map, right? So I think you have to figure out what you're trying to do, and it sounds simplistic, but if you try and understand who your audience is and what the functionality is, don't start by saying, is it a map or is it not a map? Start by saying, what are we trying to do? How do these people interact with information? What's the story we're trying to tell? And then map might be a great option for some things and not for others.
I agree entirely.
What he said.
I agree entirely with that. I'm generally against maps as a starting point. I often negate the map and you get into the nuance of the data and then determine, is a map the right choice? But don't start at map.
Love it. Don't start with a map. So to summarize today's conversation, we're in a wild west of data that people can use in many different ways. So bring in some participatory aspects, so you're getting the stakeholders and everyone else involved. And these people are your gunslingers while we're out there. So go find them, look them all up. I know we'll all be here after this. Thank you all so much for your attention to your questions. Great stuff.